Now, besides objects, another crucial JavaScript value type are arrays. Though technically arrays are objects, but they are special kinds of objects. Now, an array is created by using square brackets, opening and closing square brackets. And the idea behind an array simply is that you can create a list of values. So where objects allow you to group values together with key value pairs, the idea behind arrays is to have just values which are stored in a certain order and which can be accessed by their position in that list. So for example here, if I have an array of hobbies, let's say sports, cooking, and reading, if I have such an array, I can access the array values by using square brackets after the name of the variable or constant that stores my array. So by using these square brackets here. And then there I use the index, as it's called, of the element I want to output in this case. Now the index starts at 0. So sports here has an index of 0, cooking has an index of 1, reading has an index of 2. If I want to output sports here, I would therefore access hobbies, square brackets, 0. With that, if we reload this and take a look at the console, I would see sports. Now arrays are a super common value type in JavaScript because it turns out that you quite often need to store a list of values. For example, in this demo React application I showed you earlier in the course, there also was a content array which actually contained more arrays as values, because that's also important to know. Arrays can contain any kinds of values. They can contain other arrays, objects, numbers, strings, whatever you want. Here I have an array of more arrays, and those inner nested arrays then actually contain strings. Now, when defining an array, the individual values that make up the array are separated by commas, and then, as mentioned, you access values by their index. Now, since arrays are such a super important, very common value type in JavaScript, there actually also are a couple of built-in utility methods you can use on arrays to transform or read the values stored in the arrays. You can access these utility array methods by using the array name and then the dot notation, and then you should automatically get a suggestion of the methods that are available here. For example, there is the push method, which allows you to add a new item to an array, for example, working. If I add this here and I then console log hobbies, you will see that now hobbies here actually contains 4 elements, therefore ending with the index 3, since we start at the index 0. And the last element is this working string I just pushed onto the array. Now there of course are way more methods, and I'm not going to explain them all here, but for example another method which you should know, which can be quite useful sometimes, is the findIndex method. This is a method that allows you to find the index of a certain value. For this, findIndex actually takes a function as an input, and that's a great use case for using such an arrow function, since it's super short to write and not a lot of characters to type. This arrow function, which you pass to findIndex, should accept at least one input parameter, which could be called item, because findIndex behind the scenes will execute this function, which you're passing to findIndex, and will automatically provide a value for this input parameter. Therefore, of course, your function also must accept it in order to then use it in this function body. Now in this function body, in case of findIndex, you then should return true if you have the item that you were looking for, and false otherwise. For that, we can return item equals sports, for example, if we were looking for the index of the item sports. So if we were looking for the index of this item. What this code here does is it executes this function automatically behind the scenes for every item in this array, including this working item, which was pushed onto the array. And then for every item, it compares that item, so that text here, to this text with help of this comparison operator, which I mentioned before. If the two are equal, this function here returns true, and therefore findIndex knows that I found the item I was looking for, and it will then give me the index of that item. Otherwise, this will return false, and findIndex will do nothing. So therefore here, I could store that index in a constant, and then console log it. If I save that here, I get 0, because indeed sports, which is the item I'm looking for here, has the index 0, since it's the first item in that array. Now this code can definitely be a bit more challenging to understand, since we're passing a function to another function, and that's also something I'll get back to a little bit later in this section again. But in the end, all that's happening here is that findIndex needs a function which it can execute on our behalf, and it will execute this function for every item in this array. It will pass that item for every execution into that function, and therefore, of course, item will be different for every execution. It will be those items here. And then we compare the item we're getting to some value we're looking for. So this value we're looking for, of course, is defined by us, the developer. That's how this function here works. Now, as a side note, if you have code like this, an arrow function where all you do in the function body, so between these curly braces, is return something, you can even shorten this code and get rid of the return statement and get rid of these curly braces and write this code like this. Also get rid of this semicolon here. This is then the shortest possible way of writing this, and another advantage of using such an arrow function, because this is now a very short, concise piece of code for defining a function that takes an input called item and then compares that input to some other value to yield true if these are equal or false otherwise. Now, another very useful utility method you'll see a lot throughout this course is the map method. Map allows you to transform every item in an array to another item. For that, map, just like findIndex, takes a function as an input, typically such an arrow function, since this is such a short and concise way of writing this. And like this arrow function for findIndex, this arrow function here also will receive every item in the array as an input, because this function also will be executed automatically by map for every item in the array, and every item of the array will then be provided as an input value to this function when it's being executed. And then here you return the value this item should be transformed to. For example, item plus exclamation mark. So that I add an exclamation mark to every string here. This, of course, is just a dummy example, but when working with React, you'll use this map method a lot for outputting list content, for mapping data into such JSX elements. But that is something I'll get back to later again. Here I'm just mapping my items to strings with an exclamation mark at the end. And what map will do is it will not edit the original array. Instead, that array will stay unchanged. And instead, map will return a new array, which I'll name edited hobbies. If I then console log edited hobbies here, and I reload this page, I therefore get my edited hobbies here, with all these exclamation marks at the end. So that's what map does, and since we'll see map quite a bit throughout this course, I definitely wanted to mention it here. Now, what's important to note about map is that you can really use it to transform any item to any other kind of item. For example, here we don't have to convert our strings to new strings. Instead, I could also convert them to JavaScript objects. For that, I would create an object with opening and closing curly braces, which here, however, would have to be wrapped with parentheses, since otherwise they would be treated as the parentheses that wrap the function body. If I instead want to return a JavaScript object, I have to wrap the curly braces with parentheses, and this will tell JavaScript that these curly braces will not define the function body of this arrow function, but instead will define a new object returned by that arrow function. And then here, I could define any key of my choice and, for example, store the item, which in this case will be such a string, as a value for that key. Really, you can create any kinds of values here. Any objects of any shape, numbers, strings, booleans, whatever you want. Here, in this example, I'll in the end create a new array that's full of JavaScript objects, where every object has a text key, which value is the value from the old array. So if we save this code and reload this, I now have a bunch of objects in my array. And if I expand those, you see that I have this text key here. And the value then is the value I had before in my array. And that's of course the case for all these objects.